Does your family gather for special occasions? Maybe Christmas, maybe Easter, maybe Thanksgiving. I mean, you know, it's that meal that your mom or your wife or your grandma spends like all day in the kitchen and then lays out a feast as it were fit for a king. Well, I know in our home, those three events, Christmas, Easter, and Thanksgiving, are big events in our house. I mean, my wife spends countless hours preparing and getting something really ready. And when we all sit down at the table, man, I mean, it is a feast. And by the middle of the day, after we've eaten, you know what we want to do, right? Take a nap. You know, meals can be very memorable, and meals can be times when families can share their heart and actually can think back. All of us, I would suspect, have lived long enough to have been able to remember the days when someone sat at our table who the next year isn't there. And so the next year and the next year, as we sit at the table, we remember the one who is no longer at our table. We remember the last time they ate with us. Well, you know, the Lord Jesus and his disciples, as they were coming to the day before his crucifixion, now on Thursday, they had a meal together. You remember what we call it? We call it the Last Supper. Well, we call it the Last Supper, but sometimes we forget that John and Peter and the other disciples, they had no idea it was the last time they would celebrate Passover with Jesus. They didn't sit around the table that night thinking, well, next year Jesus won't be at the table. But Jesus knew. 1,500 years earlier than Jesus and his disciples meeting, the Jews were captive in Egypt. They were slaves in Egypt. And God had sent plague after plague after plague trying to get the Pharaoh to let his people go. You might remember the story in the Old Testament, and nothing seemed to change the heart of Pharaoh. And so God said, on this night, I'll change the heart of Pharaoh, because on this night, the firstborn in every home, from every flock, will die, except the people who are in a home protected by blood. We call it the Passover because it was on that night that the death angel passed over the homes where there was blood had been sprinkled and had been placed on the doorposts of those homes. The Jews had made a sacrifice, had taken the blood, had put it on the door, had remained in the home. And that night, when Pharaoh's firstborn died, when the firstborn from every family died, the Jews who were in their home, protected by the blood, were safe. Well, the Lord went on in the years that followed and said, I want you to remember that night. I want you to remember the night of Passover in such a way that you'll never forget. So he established the celebration, if you will, of Passover, the feast of Passover, Pesach as it's known. And on the night before his crucifixion, like year after year after year in the past, Jesus sat down with his disciples to celebrate the Passover. They would go through the ritual that had grown up over the years. They would go through all of the typical customs of the Jewish families as they would come together for Passover. But on this night, something was different. Jesus was going to take the elements of Passover and begin to put a little different emphasis on it, and the disciples weren't going to understand on that night, but they would understand in the days to come. Jesus began to tell them things like this: "This is my body, which is for you. This blood, this cup will remind you of my blood." You know, what we call the Last Supper, we also call communion. Because in the church, the celebration of communion, not Passover, we don't celebrate Passover, we celebrate a communion service, which points us back to this night as Jesus was telling his disciples, "I'm going to die." Now, they didn't understand it, and there were lots of things about it that were unimaginable to the disciples, but Jesus knew, and he was preparing them. The last night of his life on earth was spent with his disciples. Around that table that night, as the disciples leaned on their pillows and sat around on the floor, remember, one of them at that table was already plotting for the death of Jesus. In the midst of that Last Supper, you remember Jesus said, "One of you is going to betray me. One of you is going to sell me to my enemies." And the disciples, remember? They said, "Lord, is it I? Lord, am I the one? Is it me, Lord?" And the Lord said, "Well, the one that I dip my bread in." And then it said Judas left the room. The disciples didn't realize why he left, but we know, because we know the end of the story. Imagine yourself around that table, not knowing what was coming that night, not knowing what was coming the next day, certainly not knowing what was going to happen over the next hundreds of years. Try to put yourself around that table that night, maybe wondering what is happening. You could tell there was something different, but you couldn't quite understand. Put yourself around that table. But now that we do know what was happening, now that we do know what Jesus was preparing them for, I need you now to stop and say, would I have been Judas, or would I have been one of the 11? You know, yesterday I asked you to ask yourself that question because Judas had made the plot, he had made the plan, he had made the transaction with the leaders of the Jewish nation. Are you one that would want to look like you love Jesus enough to sit around an intimate family meal, as it were? But in your heart, you know that you absolutely hate him. Now, as we prepare for Easter, as we're thinking ahead, again, it reminds us that Jesus is coming again. The hope of our salvation is that one day Jesus will come to get us. Maybe it will be on a communion Sunday. You know, in our church, we celebrate communion typically on the first Sunday of the month. Not because it's biblical, not because it was mandated, but it just is sort of traditional and it makes sense to do it once a month. I've often thought to myself how exciting it would be if when I said, take this in remembrance of Jesus, it was at that moment Jesus came back. But my fear is that even in our church, some would be left sitting in the pews while the rest of us went. Which one would you be? You know, the Apostle Paul said that as we celebrate communion, we do it looking ahead to the coming of Jesus. So today, think about the communion services you've been in. Ask yourself if it really causes you to be excited about the return of Jesus Christ. And if it doesn't, change your heart. Because in this year, in Easter 2018, I want us to remember that our hope is in the fact that Jesus is coming again.